The sun was setting over the Pacific when Captain Lewis glanced at his fuel gauge and realized he wasn't going to make it home. The P-38's twin engines hummed steady, but the numbers didn't lie. He'd burned too much chasing the last formation, too much in the climb, too much when the fight got close. Now, 1,000 miles of ocean stretched between him and base, and the needle was sinking toward empty. He did the math again, slower this time, hoping for a different answer. It didn't change. He keyed his radio. "Control, this is Blue 4. Fuel's gone. Repeat, I won't make it back." Static. Then a faint voice. "Try to stretch it. Kill one engine if you have to." Lewis blinked. "Say again?" "Feather it. Kill one engine. You'll glide twice as far." He hesitated. Every instinct screamed no. Shutting down an engine in flight was something you did when you were already dead, when fire tore through the nacelle or a prop was about to rip off. You didn't do it on purpose, but there were no other choices left. He reached out, hand trembling, and pulled the mixture control back. The right engine coughed, sputtered, and fell silent. The vibration faded, replaced by the eerie whisper of air sliding over metal. The P-38 dipped for a moment, then steadied. The world went quiet. The ocean below glimmered like glass, unbroken except for the faint shimmer of his shadow sliding across it. The only sound was wind. No roar, no engine thrum, just silence. He watched the fuel needle. It barely moved. The impossible was happening. The lightning was gliding, smooth and level, eating up miles with barely a drop burned. For the first time in his career, Lewis realized that silence could save your life. By 1943, America's air war had become an ocean of numbers. Sorties, fuel loads, flight hours, tonnage dropped. But behind those clean figures was a brutal truth no report could soften. The Pacific wasn't a battlefield. It was a graveyard for aircraft that simply ran out of sky. Every pilot stationed there learned the same lesson on day one. The ocean doesn't forgive math errors. At Henderson Field, the air smelled of hot oil and wet coral dust. Pilots joked, smoked, and checked their maps under tin-roofed lean-tos, pretending not to think about what lay between them and the next target. Their aircraft, P-38 Lightnings, B-25 Mitchells, F-4F Wildcats, sat lined in the heat, tanks topped off with fuel that had arrived 3 islands and 4 miracles away. A ground crewman would slap the aluminum skin near the nose and grin. "You've got full tanks, Lieutenant. Don't waste it." They all said it like a joke, but everyone knew there was no such thing as full. Every mission plan was an argument against physics. 1,000 miles out meant 1,000 miles back. And that was before combat, before climbs, before evasive turns, or the simple fact that no engine ever ran as cleanly in war as it did in a test. And yet the orders kept coming. Escort the bombers, sweep the bay, intercept at dawn. Fuel wasn't strategy. It was the invisible front line. Pilots learned to listen to their engines the way a sailor listens to wind and water. The merest change in tone, a rough cough, a deeper thrum, could mean the difference between making it home and dying nameless in the waves. They joke about gas anxiety, but every man who'd flown past the halfway point of a mission felt it. That creeping dread when the fuel gauge needle started to wander, and the horizon seemed to stretch. Just a little farther away, Captain Arthur, Red Maddox, a P-38 pilot out of Guadalcanal, once said that flying in the Pacific felt like living on a stopwatch. He kept a chalk mark on his instrument panel, a small line that told him exactly when he had to turn back. No excuses, no heroics. The Pacific doesn't care about courage, he said. It only cares about gallons. Still, some pushed it too far. On the 27th of June, a 6-ship formation of P-38s returned from a long-range sweep near Bougainville. They were meant to rendezvous with bombers, but cloud cover scattered them. By the time they regrouped, the fight was gone, and so was the fuel. Lieutenant Harland "Hawk" Doyle was the youngest of the group, 21 years old, still had the factory paint smell on his flight jacket. As they turned for home, his voice crackled over the radio. "Gauge reads dry on left. Switching tanks." His squadron leader, Captain Maddox, replied calmly, "Hold altitude. Conserve throttle. We'll nurse her home." But Doyle's plane was light, twitchy. He kept drifting behind. Every minute he burned just a little too much. The others could hear him breathing on the radio. Short, tight gasps, the kind that came when you were doing math you didn't want to finish. Then came the silence. "Hawk, come in." Nothing. Maddox circled once, twice. Below, the Pacific stretched like a living mirror, sunlight flashing off endless blue. Then, in the distance, a streak of silver, a small splash. He never saw Doyle again. When they landed, mechanics drained the tanks of the surviving aircraft. Most had less than a pint left. One pilot had just enough to taxi 50 yards. They'd made it, but barely. That night, at the mess tent, the survivors sat quiet. No toasts, no stories. Just spoons clinking against tin bowls and the low hum of a generator in the dark. Someone muttered, "There's got to be a better way." That was how it always started. Not with invention, but with frustration. Men tired of watching friends disappear over the horizon because of something as stupid as fuel. Rumors spread quickly in a war zone. Someone said a C-47 pilot had once killed one engine and glided halfway back from a recon mission. Someone else mentioned a bomber crew that had done the same over New Guinea. The stories changed with every telling, but the seed was planted. Maybe less, could be more. The old-timers scoffed. You kill one engine in a twin, you're halfway to the grave already. But the younger ones listened. A pilot named Ensign Victor Lane, a wiry 23-year-old flying PBY Catalinas, started testing it in secret. On long patrols where no one could see, he'd feather one prop, level off, and feel the drag fade. The silence would stretch out, eerie, beautiful, endless. Then he'd restart, heart hammering as the engine coughed back to life. One day, he came back from a 14-hour patrol with nearly a quarter tank left. His crew couldn't believe it. "Either the fuel gauge is busted," one joked, "or you've found religion." Lane didn't smile. "No, I just shut one down for a while." Word traveled fast. Not officially, not in briefings, but through whispers in hangars, muttered talk over cigarettes. He turned it off, and it worked. That was when the idea started to take root. Flying across the Pacific meant crossing a space so vast it bent the imagination. There was no margin for error, no second chance. If you could find a way to stretch every drop of fuel, even by 10 minutes, it could be the difference between a mayday and a miracle. So pilots began to experiment, cautiously, quietly. A few at first, then more, always over water. Always with the fear that one mistake would turn sky into tomb. It wasn't in any manual. No engineer had signed off on it. But by 1944, across 1,000 islands and hundreds of airstrips, men were learning a new rule of survival. Sometimes, to go farther, you had to stop moving at all. The first time Lieutenant Warren Mac McAllister shut down an engine deliberately, he did it by accident. He was flying a P-38 Lightning out of Green Island, ferrying supplies after a routine patrol. It was late afternoon, the air thick and golden, and his gauges told him what he already knew. He didn't have enough fuel to make it back to base. For 10 minutes, he argued with the math. For the next 10, he argued with God. Then, on a strange impulse, he feathered his left propeller. The sound died instantly. The Lightning lurched, yawed, and for a second he thought it would flip into the sea. But he caught it, booted right rudder, trimmed the nose, and leveled out. The silence that followed was unreal. Only the wind hissed across the canopy. His right engine thrummed softly, steady and slow. And yet, the plane didn't seem to fall. It just glided. He watched the fuel needle. It barely moved. The airspeed held. It wasn't just working. It was working better than it should have. He made it back with fuel to spare. When he landed, the crew chief stared at the remaining gas and shook his head. "You flying downhill all the way?" McAllister grinned, then hesitated. "Not exactly." Word spread, as it always did. Within days, others were trying it too. Cautiously at first. Testing at altitude, where a mistake wouldn't kill them immediately. They called it dead stick cruising, or just the trick. The logic was simple. One engine meant half the fuel burn, less drag, less noise, but it took a steady hand. Twin-engine aircraft were never designed for this. The asymmetry could tear a plane apart if you didn't compensate perfectly. At Henderson, pilots began to compare notes in chalk on mess hall walls. Feather at 12,000. Left. Keep speed above 190. Don't. Try it in turbulence. No one dared tell command. Official. Doctrine said both engines must be kept running during all flight operations. Shutting one down deliberately was considered reckless, even suicidal. If you mentioned it in a report, the flight officer would simply write pilot error. But war has always been built on men breaking rules quietly. One crew chief, Corporal Danny Hughes, began marking the aircraft that returned with unusually high fuel reserves. "You're one of the ghosts," he'd say, flying on silence. At first, the results seemed like luck. But after a dozen flights, patterns emerged. Pilots flying PBY Catalinas with their enormous wingspans could stay aloft for hours longer using one engine. Even fighters P-38s and P-61 Black Widows could stretch their range by 30 to 40% if they balanced perfectly. The key wasn't just killing an engine, it was learning to live with silence. Flying with one motor dead changed everything. The airplane handled differently, heavier, more fragile. The nose wanted to pull toward the live engine. The rudder fought you every second. If you overcorrected, you could spin out in an instant. "Feels like balancing a bowling ball on a knife," one pilot wrote in his logbook. But for some, it became second nature. In one daring test, a B-25 crew shut down both engines over the Solomon Sea just to see how far they could glide. They descended almost 30 miles before restarting. The pilot said the quiet was so absolute, he could hear the ocean breathing. By late 1944, what began as a rumor had turned into a quiet revolution. Pilots ferrying planes from island to island began training themselves. When to feather, when to restart, how to manage drag. Some took it further, using the silence tactically. Long-range recon flights began cutting engines over enemy territory to avoid radar and sound detection. One Navy PB-4Y crew glided silently into Truck Lagoon at dawn. Cameras rolling, then restarted and escaped before the enemy even knew they were there. When intelligence officers reviewed the footage, they couldn't believe it. "How the hell were you not heard?" The pilot smiled. "We just stopped talking. It wasn't in the manual. It wasn't official. But it was spreading, like wildfire. Still, for every success, there were failures, engines that refused to restart, feathering systems that jammed, pilots who pushed the silence too far and never came back. Every hangar had its own whispered story. A man who glided too low, a prop that never caught again, a name scratched off a door. But that was the cost of discovery. One sergeant summed it up best while tightening a bolt under a sunburned wing. "Every trick that saves your life starts out by killing someone else first." By the winter of 1944, the trick wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was a language, one spoken quietly, in hangars, at briefing tables, on long flights over endless blue. They called it dead sticking, but among the pilots who lived by it, it had another name, the ghost glide. Every man who used it learned a different rhythm. Some feathered their engine the moment they hit cruising altitude. Others waited until the gauges dipped just below comfort. A few shut down in bursts. Off for a minute, on again to climb, off once more to drift. What united them wasn't bravado, but belief. They'd all seen how far a plane could go on silence. And once you felt that, the eerie, weightless drift, the hum of wind replacing the roar of combustion, it changed how you thought about flying altogether. Captain Lee Harmon, who ferried Catalinas out of Espiritu Santo, described it in his logbook. It's like slipping through a dream. You feel the earth pull, the air lift, the wings breathe. The engines are gone, and for a moment, you're flying the way birds do, on the grace of what's already there. To outsiders, it sounded poetic, even foolish, but the technique worked. For long-range reconnaissance and search and rescue missions, it doubled their reach. Planes that should have turned back with empty tanks now made it home with fuel left in the lines. On a humid night in late '44, a squadron of Navy liberators launched from the Marshall Islands on a search grid stretching nearly 1,000 miles. Each carried barely enough gas to make the turn. Halfway through the mission, the lead pilot, Commander Ray Mason, ordered 2 engines shut down. The radio logs captured the silence that followed. Nothing but static for 40 minutes. Then his voice again, calm and clipped. Still gliding. We've covered 110 miles without burn. When they returned to base, the engineers ran the numbers twice. Mason's crew had achieved nearly double their expected endurance. What began as superstition was now measurable science. The flight engineers started testing fuel curves, measuring glide ratios, charting lift and drag under varying loads. The more they studied it, the more they realized something profound. Silence wasn't the absence of power. It was control, redefined. A twin-engine aircraft at full throttle was brute force, but on one engine, or none, it was balance, precision, intuition. Dead stick flying wasn't just about saving fuel anymore. It was about mastery. Some pilots compared it to meditation. You felt every vibration, every pressure shift through the stick and seat. You learned to read the sky like a pulse. One said it was like walking a tightrope between gravity and faith. Even command began to notice. Not officially, of course. The manuals didn't change. The training schools never mentioned it. But veterans whispered about certain captains who could ride the quiet for hours, and whose crews came home when others didn't. The phenomenon spread to the Army Air Forces, to B-25s, P-38s, and even to the massive B-24s that crawled across the Pacific. In the air, silence became a signal. A pilot cutting power to disappear from radar, to drift through a cloud bank unseen, to creep toward a target without a sound. During one dusk mission off the Marianas, a PBY Catalina spotted a stranded destroyer crew. Out of fuel and far from base, the pilot killed both engines and glided the last few miles, landing in near darkness. When asked later how he managed it, he said, "Didn't need engines to fall toward mercy. There was poetry in it, yes, but also fatal risk. Every glide was a bet. Every restart a prayer. Feather too soon, and you'd stall. Wait too long, and the fuel lines would cool, the oil congeal. Sometimes the starter would fail, or the magnetos would misfire, and you'd find yourself hanging between heaven and sea with nothing but air left to hold you up. And yet, they kept doing it, because in the war's long fatigue, After years of noise, smoke, and fire, the silence felt holy. There, in the stillness between life and death, they found something that no manual could teach: the art of trusting the air itself. The morning light barely touched the coral reefs around Kwajalein when Lieutenant Mark Fields climbed into his B-25 Mitchell, fuel tanks brimming yet barely enough for the round trip. His crew shuffled in, double-checking bombs, charts, and radio gear. Today, the mission wasn't just reconnaissance or bombing, it was endurance. Fields had been practicing dead-stick flights for months, watching fuel gauges, calculating glide ratios, memorizing how the plane felt at every throttle setting. But now, it was real. They lifted off quietly, engines humming in the humid dawn, climbing toward the cloud banks that hung like a curtain over the horizon. The target lay nearly 600 miles away, a small Japanese-held atoll barely visible through the haze. By the time they reached 30,000 feet, Fields cut one engine, then the other, letting the propellers windmill silently in the breeze. The B-25 shuddered but held steady. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Collins, swallowed hard. "You're really doing it, sir?" Fields nodded without looking down. "We've planned for this. Just follow the trim." For the next 40 minutes, the plane glided. A massive, heavy metal bird riding invisible currents. The silence inside the cockpit almost unnatural. The usual roar of engines was replaced by the whistle of wind across the fuselage, the faint creak of struts, the rhythmic tapping of gauges. The crew leaned forward, senses alert. Any miscalculation could send them into a stall, hundreds of miles from base. Yet, the beauty of it was undeniable. The aircraft responded as if alive, each subtle shift in weight and lift predictable, almost obedient. When they approached the target, Fields restarted one engine to gain altitude. The Japanese had radar, but the gliding B-25 arrived mostly undetected. Bombs were dropped with surgical precision, and the plane turned for home, engines killed once more. The glide back became a tense ballet. The men knew that if anything went wrong, if a restart failed or a gust pushed them too low, there would be no second chance. The ocean stretched endlessly below, shimmering with heat and reflection, a mirror of the sky above. Hours later, Kwajalein appeared, tiny against the horizon. Fields feathered the throttles just in time, engines sputtering to life for a controlled landing. As the wheels touched the tarmac, the crew exhaled as one, shaken but alive. Their mission was recorded as a success, more than just in bombing accuracy. They had doubled the range of the aircraft without adding fuel, proving that dead-stick flying wasn't a desperate trick anymore. It was strategy, precision, and courage, distilled into a single, silent act. In the debriefing, Fields's commanding officer shook his head in disbelief. "You didn't just fly the plane, you let it lead you. That's something else," Fields smiled faintly. "We didn't fly it fast. We flew it smart." By the end of 1944, dead-stick missions became standard for long-range reconnaissance in the Pacific. Pilots who mastered the technique could strike farther, evade detection, and save lives. What had started as superstition among a few, daring aviators became one of the quietest yet most effective tactics of the war. The engines may have been dead, but the planes and their pilots had never felt more alive. The Pacific sun beat down on the maintenance tarmac at Henderson Field, casting long shadows of B-25s and their crews. Inside the briefing room, Lieutenant Fields traced the flight path of the previous mission on a waxed map, lines looping like veins across the ocean. He explained to a new group of recruits exactly what had made their long-range glide possible. "It isn't magic," Fields said, tapping the map. "It's math, physics. Know your aircraft's weight, your altitude, wind direction, and air density. Every throttle adjustment, every turn, every slight pitch of the nose affects how far you go. Misjudge it, and the ocean swallows you before you even see land. The recruits leaned forward, pencils ready. Fields outlined fuel calculations for every leg of a mission, showing how gliding on dead engines could extend range by 50% or more. He described the delicate dance of feathering propellers to reduce drag, how to use thermals and updrafts to gain extra miles, and how to restart engines mid-flight without stalling the aircraft. Every detail mattered. Even a half-degree tilt could mean the difference between reaching the target or ditching in the Pacific. Dead-stick flying was physically demanding. Pilots reported fatigue from the constant mental calculations required to maintain glide ratios, airspeed, and heading. They had to ignore instinctive panic when engines died, trusting their training and the aircraft's design. One misstep could trigger a stall or spin at high altitude. Fatal mistakes in a B-25 loaded with bombs and fuel. The technique spread across units slowly at first, as commanders were skeptical. "You want them to cut engines? Are you insane?" some officers asked, eyebrows raised. But after multiple successful long-range reconnaissance and bombing missions, the method became doctrine. Training manuals were rewritten, flight simulators adapted, and new pilots drilled on engine-out procedures before ever leaving base. By mid-1944, the dead-stick technique had influenced operational strategy across the Pacific theater. Aircraft previously limited to 300-400-mile missions suddenly had operational reach of 600-700 miles, allowing surprise attacks on Japanese supply lines, outposts, and fortifications previously considered safe due to distance. Pilots could glide silently over enemy territory, avoid radar detection, and strike targets with precision before engine power needed to be restored. The tactical advantages were staggering. Convoys were intercepted farther from base. Island garrisons were disrupted before reinforcements could arrive. The Japanese forces, still relying on radar detection and visual observation, often saw B-25s appear as if by magic. A silent, gliding predator. Pilots reported the psychological effect as well. Japanese gunners would often panic at aircraft that appeared without engine noise, increasing the effectiveness of bombing runs. Beyond tactical gains, dead-stick flying transformed pilot training. Schools introduced dedicated programs, lessons on wind currents over the Pacific, gliding techniques with different payloads, and emergency engine-out procedures at every altitude. Pilots practiced over simulated islands and reefs, perfecting approaches that combined precision navigation with aerodynamic finesse. Fields himself traveled from base to base, observing sorties, coaching crews, and tweaking procedures. His reports noted that pilots who mastered the technique not only increased mission success, but often returned with fewer casualties. Fuel management became an art, and pilots learned to listen to the plane, feeling subtle vibrations through the controls that indicated drag, wind, or minor mechanical issues. Instructors called it collective flying awareness, the ability to treat the aircraft as an extension of the body rather than a machine. By late 1944, historians and engineers would marvel at how far dead-stick techniques had pushed the limits of propeller-driven aircraft. The Pacific theater, once defined by vast distances and logistical limits, now became a proving ground for pilot skill, precision engineering, and daring. Mission after mission, dead engines had carried planes farther than designers initially imagined, saving fuel, increasing range, and striking at targets once thought untouchable. Yet the story wasn't just numbers. Survivors from these missions told the human side, the tension of silent flight, the eerie quiet that replaced engine roar, and the moment when one engine sputtered back to life as the crew neared the target. Pilots described a mixture of fear and exhilaration, a heightened awareness of every movement of their aircraft, every cloud, every gust of wind. It became a test of nerve as much as skill, and those who mastered it earned the respect of every crew in the theater. In the decades after the war, veterans recounted these missions with reverence. They spoke of B-25s gliding like ghosts over coral reefs, of the calm calculation in the cockpit, and of the silent triumph that only true skill could achieve. Engineers studied the techniques, incorporating lessons into post-war designs, while historians credited the approach with enabling a string of successful long-range operations that helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Fields would often say, years later, that it wasn't heroism that saved crews. It was preparation, precision, and trusting the aircraft when it seemed the world had gone silent. Dead engines were no longer a sign of failure. They were a tool, a weapon, and a lifeline. By teaching pilots to kill their engines deliberately, the U.S. military had gained a tactical advantage that reached far beyond technology. It became a philosophy, a mindset, and a silent strategy that reshaped the air war across the Pacific. By early 1944, the U.S. Air Command had integrated deadstick techniques into major operational plans. Long-range missions over the Caroline and Marshall Islands now relied on pilots trained to fly silently for miles, gliding past enemy radar posts and outmaneuvering interceptors without revealing their presence. One mission over Truk Lagoon, a heavily fortified Japanese naval base, demonstrated the full potential of the technique. A squadron of B-25 Mitchells, fully loaded with bombs and fuel, took off at dawn. Engines roared at full throttle for takeoff, but once the planes reached cruising altitude over open water, the lead pilot, Major Harold Jensen, signaled the unusual command. Engines idle. Glide formation. The formation tilted slightly, propellers feathered, and the engines dropped to minimal RPM. The squadron's approach was nearly silent. Only the faint hum of wind against the fuselage hinted at their presence. Radar operators in Truk saw nothing. Lookouts reported distant glimmers on the horizon, but the gliders appeared like mirages against the rising sun. The squadron glided for nearly 120 miles, maintaining formation with precise control. Pilots adjusted pitch, monitored airspeed, and calculated descent angles constantly. One misjudgment, even by a single degree, would have sent a bomber into the coral reefs below. As they neared the lagoon, Jensen ordered engines restarted at the last possible moment. Propellers whirred back to life just in time for a steep dive-bombing run. Bombs struck Japanese supply depots, fuel stores, and anchored ships with surgical precision. Anti-aircraft guns reacted too late. The silent approach had kept the squadron invisible until the final seconds. Other missions further proved the technique's tactical value. Reconnaissance planes glided across hundreds of miles of open ocean, spotting convoys and enemy airfields without alerting defenders. Search and rescue flights adopted deadstick procedures to recover downed pilots behind enemy lines, approaching quietly, then reviving engines only for takeoff once the rescue was complete. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese pilots reported the sudden appearance of American bombers with minimal warning, disrupting defensive plans and forcing hasty evasive maneuvers. U.S. pilots, meanwhile, developed a unique confidence, the knowledge that their aircraft could travel twice as far silently and still complete their mission successfully. Training emphasized not just the mechanics, but the mental discipline required. Pilots described a surreal calm during long stretches of engine-free flight. The sky, once filled with noise and tension, became a tunnel of anticipation. Pilots relied entirely on instinct, gauges, and the feel of the aircraft, learning to sense the wind's direction, the subtle shift in lift, and the plane's response to every control input. One veteran, Captain Leonard Hayes, recounted a mission over Palau where his plane lost power unexpectedly. "We were over open water, hundreds of miles from base," he said years later. "I remembered what we were taught. Trust the glide, calculate your path, control the descent. For 10 minutes, it was like flying a ghost. No noise, no panic, just the plane and the wind. When the engine kicked back in, it felt like waking from a dream. Dead-stick missions also required coordination between squadrons. Leaders had to calculate combined glides to ensure multiple aircraft arrived simultaneously, maximizing bombing effectiveness while minimizing exposure. Pilots developed hand signals and radio cues to synchronize engine restarts and dives. One misstep, and a bomber could arrive too early or too late, risking detection or collisions. By late 1944, long-range engine kill techniques were considered standard in the Pacific, influencing air strategy across campaigns. Operations at Saipan, Peleliu, and the Philippines increasingly relied on these methods to bypass heavily defended zones, strike deep inland, and return safely. Pilots who mastered it became specialists, often called upon for the most daring reconnaissance or bombing missions. Beyond mission success, the technique forged a culture of precision and adaptability. Aircrews learned to respect the limits of their aircraft while pushing them farther than anyone thought possible. The experience cultivated a rare combination of patience, calculation, and courage, traits that defined the new generation of U.S. pilots. By the war's end, dead-stick flying was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a symbol of ingenuity and adaptability under extreme conditions. Pilots who had flown engine-off missions remembered the tension, the silence, and the exhilaration. Engineers analyzed it, commanders planned around it, and the victories it enabled became a hidden but crucial part of the Pacific Campaign's success. The legacy of those glides lived on in post-war aviation. Flight schools taught pilots to manage engine failures with the same principles. Long-range bomber designs incorporated glide considerations, and the discipline of trusting instruments and intuition became a cornerstone of military training. What had begun as a daring improvisation in the South Pacific became a defining lesson in the marriage of human skill and mechanical precision. The successes of engine-off missions came with costs that were often invisible in official reports. For every pilot who mastered the glide, there were those who miscalculated wind speed, misjudged altitude, or suffered mechanical failure at a critical moment. The Pacific Ocean was unforgiving, and even a small error could mean being lost at sea, far from rescue. Captain Leonard Hayes, who had flown several of the longest glides, remembered one mission over the POW Islands where a fellow pilot misjudged a descent angle. "He never made it to the target," Hayes recalled. "We searched for hours, but the ocean doesn't give up its secrets easily." Sometimes the lesson was learned too late. Dead-stick flying demanded more than technical skill. It required psychological endurance. Pilots described a tension unlike any other. The uncanny silence, the absence of engine vibration, forced them to confront their own mortality. Some spoke of time slowing, of the minutes stretching endlessly while they carefully calculated descent paths, adjusted flaps, and monitored fuel. The mental strain was immense, and only rigorous training and natural instinct kept them alive. Engine kill missions also reshaped squadron coordination. Air commanders had to plan every glide with mathematical precision. Distance, altitude, airspeed, and wind conditions were all critical. Miscommunication could lead to mid-air collisions, missed targets, or catastrophic losses. Pilots developed a near-telepathic understanding of each other's movements, honed over hours of practice flights and simulations. Yet, for those who survived, the reward was profound. Aircraft that could glide silently across hundreds of miles gave U.S. forces an unparalleled strategic advantage. Convoys could be struck before defenders were aware, reconnaissance could penetrate enemy lines undetected, and airstrikes could be executed with surgical accuracy. It was a testament to the ingenuity of human and mechanical collaboration, a high-stakes dance where timing, skill, and courage were inseparable. Beyond immediate wartime benefits, the lessons from engine-off missions influenced post-war aviation design. Pilots returning home shared their experiences with flight schools, emphasizing engine management, glide techniques, and emergency procedures. Bomber and transport aircraft were redesigned with fuel efficiency and glide capabilities in mind, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the Pacific theater. Engineers studied the flight data meticulously. They analyzed glide ratios, propeller feathering mechanics, and fuel conservation methods. These findings shaped the development of post-war long-range bombers and commercial aircraft. The daring improvisations of wartime pilots had become technical blueprints, proving that necessity often drives innovation faster than conventional research. The human stories behind these missions also endured. Veterans recounted how gliding silently over enemy territory forced them to rely not on brute force, but on observation, calculation, and patience. It taught respect for the aircraft, respect for the environment, and a deep awareness of risk. Many described the surreal combination of terror and awe, gliding hundreds of miles in near silence, with the ocean below and the enemy never fully aware of their approach. Historians later noted that these missions changed the perception of aerial warfare. The idea that maximum engine power and speed always equaled tactical advantage was challenged. Instead, pilots learned that subtlety, patience, and creative problem-solving could deliver results far beyond conventional thinking. What seemed like a desperate improvisation had become a cornerstone of modern tactical strategy. By the end of World War II, engine kill missions were officially recognized as a remarkable achievement of pilot skill and tactical innovation. Though often overshadowed by large-scale dogfights and dramatic bombing raids, they proved that ingenuity, discipline, and courage could turn the limitations of machines into an unexpected weapon. For the pilots who lived through it, the lessons endured for decades. They remembered the silence of the glide, the tension in every maneuver, and the exhilaration of arriving undetected where speed alone could never have succeeded. And though the war ended, the discipline of engine management, the awareness of flight dynamics, and the quiet courage demanded by these missions continued to shape the next generation of aviators.